You're just a flight attendant. Get out of the way!" The shout ripped through the passenger cabin as the Boeing 747 shook violently, the pilot collapsing in the cockpit. The older man pointed at the small woman, his voice dripping with contempt. But Clara Jameson didn't stop. She walked straight forward, sat down in the captain's chair, her thin hands trembling as they gripped the controls. "Are you trying to kill us all?" Someone laughed mockingly behind her. The plane steadied. Regaining balance, the radio crackled. "Call sign Silent Hawk." And 4 F-22s simultaneously broke radio silence, roaring into the sky. Clara Jameson, 29 years old, was thin with long brown hair tied low, her gentle face carrying the quiet demeanor of someone used to being overlooked. She worked as a flight attendant on international routes from Tokyo to Los Angeles. Throughout her years of service, she had been treated like she was invisible. Passengers looked down on her, pilots rarely made conversation, and her colleagues called her shadow hostess because she moved through her duties with ghost-like efficiency. Tonight's flight carried over 300 passengers, business executives, small families, and a group of recently discharged military veterans returning home. The atmosphere had been tense from takeoff due to severe weather, the aircraft shaking repeatedly as it fought through turbulence. Clara remained calm throughout, steadying water glasses before they could spill, offering gentle smiles to comfort crying children, moving through the aisles with practiced grace even as the plane bucked and rolled. 3 hours into the flight, disaster struck without warning. Captain Morrison suddenly collapsed in the cockpit, his body convulsing as he fell unconscious. The co-pilot panicked, his hands shaking as alarms began blaring throughout the aircraft. The cabin shook violently as the autopilot disengaged, sending the massive Boeing into an uncontrolled descent. Passengers screamed in terror, some crying, others praying, luggage tumbling from overhead compartments. Clara felt something deep inside her snap to attention, an instinct she had buried for years suddenly roaring to life. She ran toward the cockpit, pushing past terrified flight attendants, her body moving with purpose she hadn't felt in a decade. "What do you think you know about flying? Get away from there." A middle-aged businessman grabbed her arm, his voice filled with panic and condescension. Clara looked at him with eyes that suddenly seemed different, colder, more focused. Without a word, she pushed past him and stepped into the cockpit. The co-pilot was hyperventilating, completely overwhelmed by the emergency. Clara slid into the captain's seat, her hands instinctively finding the controls as if they had never left. The plane stopped its deadly descent, leveling out as her fingers worked the instruments with muscle memory that defied explanation. But the passengers behind her were still screaming, still demanding answers. "This is insane," the businessman shouted. "A flight attendant can't fly a plane." More voices joined in. "She's going to kill us all!" "Someone stop her." Clara's jaw tightened, but her hands remained steady on the controls. She had spent 10 years hiding from who she used to be, 10 years pretending to be just another service worker, 10 years running from memories that haunted her dreams. But now, with 300 lives depending on her, there was no more time for hiding. The co-pilot stared at her in amazement as she adjusted the aircraft's heading with expert precision. How do you know what you're doing?" he whispered. Clara didn't answer immediately, her eyes scanning the instrument panel with the focused intensity of someone reading a familiar book. Through the chaos behind her, she caught fragments of conversations from the military veterans in the back of the plane. One of them was studying her movements, his eyes growing wider with recognition. "There's something about the way she handles those controls," he murmured to his companion. "Like she's done this before. In combat." A female passenger later recalled, "I saw that small flight attendant sit in the captain's chair, her face pale but her eyes burning with cold determination. When the plane stopped falling, I knew she wasn't an ordinary person." The co-pilot was shaking uncontrollably, completely unable to assist with the emergency. Passengers continued their verbal assault on Clara from the cabin. The same businessman who had grabbed her arm earlier was now shouting, "Are you insane? You're going to kill everyone on this plane." But Clara didn't respond to the chaos behind her. Her eyes remained locked on the altimeter and attitude indicator. her mind automatically calculating wind speed, air pressure, and optimal flight path. These were skills she had mastered years ago, skills she had hoped never to use again. She made minute adjustments to the controls, feeling the massive aircraft respond to her touch like a familiar dance partner. The plane's wild shaking began to subside, replaced by the steady vibration of controlled flight. But the mockery from the cabin continued. A flight attendant pretending to be a pilot. This is ridiculous. Clara took a deep breath, her voice barely audible above the engine noise. We're not going to die today. The radio suddenly crackled to life from air traffic control. Flight 271. Who is currently controlling the aircraft? Please confirm pilot identity immediately. Clara hesitated for exactly 1 second, knowing that her next words would change everything. Then she leaned toward the microphone and whispered, "Call sign Silent Hawk." The radio went completely silent. For 30 seconds, nothing. Then emergency lights began flashing on the control tower's radar screens at Nellis Air Force Base, 200 miles away. Within minutes, 4 F-22 Raptor fighter jets were scrambling from the runway, their afterburners lighting up the Nevada desert night. For the first time in 10 years, military radio silence was broken by a voice filled with unmistakable respect. "Silent Hawk, this is Eagle Flight. We are moving to escort position." The co-pilot stared at Clara in complete shock, his mouth hanging open. Behind them, the passenger cabin had fallen into stunned silence. The businessman who had been mocking her moments before was now speechless, his face drained of color. But in the back of the plane, one of the military veterans stood up slowly, his eyes wide with recognition and disbelief. Sergeant Rodriguez had served 3 tours in Afghanistan, had seen combat in some of the most dangerous regions on Earth. He leaned toward his companion and whispered, "Silent Hawk, that call sign. I know that call sign." His friend looked confused. "What are you talking about?" Rodriguez's voice was barely audible. 10 years ago. Batu Hills operation. My entire squad was pinned down by enemy fire. We called for air support, and this Apache helicopter appeared out of nowhere. The pilot, call sign Silent Hawk, saved all our lives with the most precise combat flying I've ever witnessed. The other veteran's eyes widened. "You're saying that flight attendant was one of the most decorated combat pilots in the military," Rodriguez finished, "but she disappeared after that mission. Rumor was her entire unit was killed, and she couldn't handle being the only survivor." Meanwhile, in the cockpit, Clara was coordinating with the F-22 escort formation. Her voice had changed completely. No longer the soft-spoken flight attendant, but the calm, authoritative tone of a combat veteran. "Eagle Flight, requesting vector to nearest military airfield. We have medical emergency on board. Need immediate medical assistance upon landing. Copy Silent Hawk, vectoring you to Nellis Air Force Base. Medical teams are standing by. It's good to hear your voice again." Clara's hands tightened on the controls at those words. She had spent a decade trying to forget, trying to be invisible, trying to escape the memories of friends who had died while she lived. But now, in flying this massive commercial aircraft with the same precision she had once used to save soldiers in combat zones, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years: purpose. The F-22s took positions around the Boeing 747, their sleek forms visible through the cockpit windows. Passengers who had been demanding Clara's removal minutes earlier were now pressing their faces to the windows, watching in awe as military fighter jets provided escort for their civilian aircraft. One child pointed excitedly, "Mom, why are those fighter planes flying with us?" His mother, who had witnessed Clara's transformation from invisible flight attendant to commanding pilot, spoke softly, "Because sometimes the people we don't notice are the ones who save us." The radio crackled again. "Silent Hawk, all aircraft in the region have been cleared from your flight path. You have priority landing clearance at Nellis." Clara keyed the microphone. "Understood, Eagle Flight. Beginning descent in 5 minutes." She turned to the co-pilot, who was still staring at her in amazement. "Can you handle the passenger announcement?" she asked quietly. Tell them we're making an emergency landing at a military base. But everyone is safe. The co-pilot nodded mutely, still processing what he had witnessed. As he made the announcement, Clara focused on the approach to Nellis Air Force Base. She had landed at this same airfield dozens of times years ago, returning from missions that remain classified to this day. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was coming home to a place she had tried so hard to forget. Sergeant Rodriguez later said, "When I heard that call sign, I stood up immediately. Silent Hawk was the Apache pilot who saved my entire squad at Batu Hills. I never imagined she was the quiet flight attendant who had been serving us coffee just hours earlier." News of Silent Hawk's return spread through military communication networks like wildfire. Within an hour, commanders at bases across the country were pulling classified files, trying to piece together the legend of the pilot who had simply vanished. Clara had once been the most skilled Apache helicopter pilot in Kraken Unit, call sign Silent Hawk, famous for precision support missions that had saved hundreds of soldiers' lives. She had earned 3 Distinguished Flying Crosses, 2 Bronze Stars, and the respect of every ground unit she had ever supported. But after the disaster at Batu Hills, when her entire squadron was killed in an ambush while she survived, Clara had requested immediate discharge from active duty. She had disappeared completely from military records, choosing anonymity over the medals and recognition that awaited her. Now, forced to save 300 civilian lives, she had spoken her call sign for the first time in a decade, sending shock waves through the entire military aviation community. The F-22s maintained perfect formation around the Boeing 747, their pilots speaking in hushed tones over secured channels. "I can't believe Silent Hawk is still alive," Eagle 2 whispered, "and flying a commercial airliner like she was born to do it," Eagle 3 responded. "Look at that approach. Textbook perfect." Inside the passenger cabin, the atmosphere had completely transformed. The businessman who had mocked Clara earlier was now silent, his face flushed with embarrassment. Other passengers were whispering among themselves, trying to understand how their ordinary flight attendant had suddenly become the focus of military fighter jet escorts. Sergeant Rodriguez made his way to the front of the cabin, his military bearing evident even in civilian clothes. He spoke quietly to the other flight attendants. "That woman, she's not just any pilot. She's a legend. She saved more lives in combat than most people save in a lifetime." The head flight attendant, Sarah, looked confused. "But she's worked with us for 3 years. She never mentioned military service." "That's because she was carrying guilt she didn't deserve," Rodriguez explained. "Sometimes the best people blame themselves for things beyond their control." Meanwhile, Clara was executing a flawless approach to Nellis Air Force Base. Her hands moved over the controls with the fluid precision of someone who had performed similar landings hundreds of times. Though never in an aircraft this size, the co-pilot watched in amazement as she compensated for crosswinds, adjusted for the runway length, and maintained perfect glide slope despite flying an aircraft she technically wasn't certified to pilot. "How long have you been hiding this?" he asked quietly. Clara's voice was steady. 10 years, 3 months, and 16 days. The number was so specific, so precise, that he realized she had been counting every single day since leaving the military. Air traffic control at Nellis was coordinating the emergency landing with military precision. "Silent Hawk, you are cleared for landing runway 09. Medical teams are standing by. Fire and rescue vehicles are in position. Copy tower, beginning final approach." As the Boeing 747 descended toward the runway, personnel at Nellis Air Force Base gathered to witness something unprecedented. A commercial airliner being flown by a legendary combat pilot, escorted by F-22 fighters, landing at a military installation. The base commander, Colonel Martinez, stood on the control tower observation deck. He had served with Clara's unit years ago, had recommended her for promotion, had watched her disappear after Batu Hills with deep regret. "Sir?" his aide asked. "Should we prepare for a formal reception?" Colonel Martinez shook his head. "She chose anonymity for a reason. We honor that choice." The massive Boeing touched down with barely a bump, Clara's experience showing in every aspect of the landing. She reversed thrust perfectly, brought the aircraft to a smooth stop, and shut down the engines with practiced efficiency. For a moment, the cabin was completely silent. Then, slowly, applause began, starting with Sergeant Rodriguez, then spreading through the entire aircraft. Passengers who had been terrified and critical just hours earlier were now standing and clapping. Some were crying with relief. Others were shaking their heads in amazement. The businessman who had grabbed Clara's arm earlier approached her as she prepared to leave the cockpit. His voice was humble. I owe you an apology, and my life. Clara looked at him with tired eyes. You don't owe me anything. I was just doing what needed to be done. As passengers began deplaning, military medical teams rushed aboard to treat the still unconscious captain. Clara stood in the cockpit doorway, watching the organized efficiency of the emergency response. It felt like coming home to a world she had tried to forget. Base personnel maintained respectful distance, but she could see recognition in their eyes. Whispered conversations, subtle salutes. Sarah, the head flight attendant, approached her colleague with new understanding. 3 years we've worked together, she said softly. I never knew. That was the point, Clara replied. I wanted to be invisible. But why? You're a hero. Clara's expression grew distant. Heroes don't watch their friends die while they survive. A young airman approached hesitantly. Ma'am? Colonel Martinez would like to speak with you, if you're willing. Clara nodded, knowing this conversation was inevitable. As she walked across the tarmac toward the base operations building, she passed rows of personnel who had stopped their duties to watch. Some were older, veterans who remembered her reputation. Others were younger, airmen who had heard stories but never expected to meet the legend. All of them showed the same quiet respect, understanding that they were witnessing something rare. A hero who had chosen invisibility over glory, service over recognition, and who had just proven that true skill never disappears. It only waits for the moment when it's needed most. If you believe every quiet person carries courage louder than fear, type I believe in silent strength. The story of the flight attendant, who was really a combat pilot, exploded across social media within hours. News outlets struggled to piece together Clara's military record, but the Department of Defense maintained strict silence about classified operations. However, it is within military circles, photos began circulating of Clara in her old flight suit, standing beside her Apache helicopter, the same quiet confidence visible even years earlier. Young pilots from multiple branches of service began reaching out through back channels, hoping to learn from someone who had become a legend. Could you teach us to fly without fear? A rookie pilot asked during one informal meeting. Clara smiled gently. Flying isn't about conquering fear. It's about using fear to keep other people alive. Within a week, Clara returned to her regular flight attendant duties on commercial airlines. But something fundamental had changed. Passengers who boarded her flights no longer saw an invisible service worker. They saw someone who carried herself with quiet authority, someone whose calm presence made them feel safer. Word spread through the aviation community about which flights Clara was working. Nervous flyers specifically requested her routes. Veterans made pilgrimages to fly on aircraft where she was serving, not because they wanted to bother her, but because they found comfort in being protected by someone they knew could handle any emergency. During one flight to Denver, severe turbulence struck the aircraft. While other passengers gripped their armrests in terror, those who knew Clara's story remained calm. We're flying with Silent Hawk, an elderly veteran told his frightened seatmate. If something goes wrong, we're in the best possible hands. The turbulence passed without incident, but the message was clear. Clara's presence had transformed from invisibility into quiet assurance. She continued performing her duties exactly as before, serving meals, comforting anxious passengers, maintaining the professional demeanor that had always defined her work. But now passengers watched her differently. They noticed how she moved through the cabin during rough weather, checking on everyone with the systematic thoroughness of someone conducting a mission. They observed how her eyes constantly scanned for potential problems, how she positioned herself to respond quickly to any emergency. One flight attendant colleague asked, "Does it feel strange having people know who you really are?" Clara considered the question while preparing meal service. I'm the same person I always was. I just stopped hiding. The military aviation community never forgot Silent Hawk's return. F-22 pilots who had provided escort that night spoke of the experience with reverence. She handled that Boeing like it was an extension of her own body, Eagle leader reported to his squadron. Watching her work reminded me why I became a pilot. Training instructors at flight schools began using Clara's emergency landing as a case study in crisis management. When standard procedures fail, when technology breaks down, when everyone else panics, true skill reveals itself, they taught their students. But Clara herself avoided all interviews, declined all speaking engagements, and refused to capitalize on her renewed fame. She had chosen anonymity once before to escape painful memories. Now she chose continued quiet service, not from guilt or trauma, but from genuine preference for substance over recognition. During a flight to Chicago, a young girl traveling alone became frightened during takeoff. Clara knelt beside her seat, speaking in the same gentle voice she had always used. "What's your name, sweetheart?" "Emma," the girl whispered. "I'm scared the plane will crash." Clara smiled with genuine warmth. "Would it help if I told you that the person making sure you're safe today used to fly much scarier missions? And she always brought everyone home?" Emma looked up with curious eyes. "Really? Really? And today is just another day when everyone goes home safely." The girl relaxed immediately, somehow sensing that this quiet woman could handle anything that might happen. As the flight continued smoothly, other passengers observed the interaction with deep respect. They were witnessing something rare, a person who had achieved legendary status in one field, choosing to excel quietly in another. No ego, no need for recognition, just consistent, professional service, backed by skills that could save lives when necessary. A business executive who had initially planned to complain about slow drink service instead found himself studying Clara's movements. He watched her check emergency equipment during quiet moments, noticed how she positioned herself to maintain visual contact with all passengers, observed the way she moved with purpose even during routine tasks. She's still in mission mode, he realized. She treats every flight like she's protecting lives, because that's exactly what she's doing. By the end of that flight, he had gained profound respect for someone he might have previously overlooked. This became the new normal for Clara. Passengers who learned her identity didn't seek autographs or selfies. Instead, they simply felt honored to be in the presence of someone who embodied quiet heroism. Children drew pictures of her. Veterans nodded respectfully when passing in the aisle. Nervous flyers relaxed knowing she was aboard. Clara had achieved something remarkable. She had transformed from invisible service worker to trusted guardian, without changing anything about how she performed her duties. If you believe in stories like this, type "Silent Heroes Fly Among Us" in the comments. 2 years have passed since Silent Hawk broke radio silence to save Flight 271. Clara continues working as a flight attendant, treating each shift with the same quiet professionalism that has always defined her service. But the aviation world has fundamentally changed around her. Flight crews who work with Clara report feeling more confident during difficult weather, knowing that if emergency strikes, they have backup unlike anywhere else in commercial aviation. Passengers specifically book flights where Clara is working, not seeking celebrity encounters, but finding comfort in traveling with someone whose competence has been proven under the most extreme circumstances. The story has become more than aviation legend. It has become a testament to the hidden depths that exist within ordinary-seeming people. Clara's actions prove that heroism doesn't require uniforms or recognition. It requires willingness to act when action matters most. Her quiet determination demonstrated that sometimes the most extraordinary capabilities are carried by those who choose to remain invisible, until invisibility is no longer an option. Airlines throughout the industry have begun reassessing their emergency protocols, realizing that experience and skill can be found in unexpected places. Flight attendants are now receiving enhanced training in crisis management, empowered to take initiative during emergencies instead of simply following rigid procedures. Young pilots seek out flights where Clara works, hoping to observe and learn from someone whose reputation transcends traditional rank structures. She obliges their curiosity with gentle guidance, sharing knowledge gained through years of combat experience and civilian service. "What makes a good pilot?" a rookie aviator asked during a recent flight. Clara considered the question while preparing landing preparations. "Understanding that every person on your aircraft represents someone's entire world. You're not just flying a machine, you're protecting every story, every dream, every future that depends on you bringing them home safely." The young pilot nodded, understanding that he was receiving wisdom that couldn't be taught in any flight school. Military aviation communities continue honoring Silent Hawk's legacy. New Apache pilots learn her techniques. F-22 squadrons study her crisis management approaches. Air Force academies include her story in their ethics curricula. But Clara herself remains focused entirely on present duties. She has never sought to return to military service, never attempted to capitalize on her renewed recognition, never tried to leverage her story into personal advancement. Each morning, she reports for duty with the same quiet efficiency that has always characterized her work. Each flight, she maintains the same watchful care for passenger safety, the same gentle attention to nervous travelers, the same professional competence that transforms routine service into acts of protection. Recently, Emma, the young girl Clara had comforted years earlier, boarded one of her flights as a teenager. "You probably don't remember me," Emma said shyly, "but you helped me not be scared of flying when I was little." Clara smiled with genuine warmth. "Of course I remember you. How are you doing?" "I'm studying to become a pilot now," Emma replied, "because I want to make people feel as safe as you made me feel." Clara's eyes filled with quiet pride. "That's the best reason I've ever heard for choosing aviation." As Emma found her seat, Clara realized that her greatest victory wasn't saving Flight 271, wasn't earning military decorations, wasn't breaking radio silence to summon F-22 escorts. Her greatest victory was inspiring a frightened child to transform fear into purpose, to choose protecting others as her life's mission. Today, in airports around the world, there are flight attendants who carry themselves with quiet confidence, understanding that their role involves far more than serving meals and providing comfort. Some are veterans hiding extraordinary backgrounds. Others are civilians who have simply learned that ordinary people can accomplish extraordinary things when circumstances demand action. They don't seek recognition or praise. They seek something far more valuable: the knowledge that they stand ready to protect lives, to act decisively when others panic, to be the calm presence that transforms crisis into survival. If you believe in stories like this, leave a comment below and don't forget to subscribe to SN Touching Stories. We tell the stories that shouldn't be forgotten. Real people creating and telling stories, not mass-produced AI. Because every Silent Hawk deserves recognition. Every quiet hero deserves respect. And every person who chooses service over glory deserves our gratitude. This story is dedicated to all the hidden heroes working among us. The veterans serving coffee, the former doctors driving taxis, the retired teachers cleaning buildings. Their past achievements may be invisible, but their character shines through everything they do.